All right. We got folks coming in here. All right. So on the left side, you can see I started this community bicycle shop about 20 years ago. In the background, you can see some milk crates with parts everywhere. People would donate their old bicycles. You just see piles and piles of bikes, right? I started my journey doing community-based advocacy work in the basement of this church. And what we really were trying to do at the beginning in Memphis, which is where I'm from, was to serve the need for affordable bicycles. The problem that we had encountered, and you see us here with these young people, is that folks couldn't afford bicycles or bicycle parts in the city where I lived, in the neighborhood where we worked. And so we wanted to start a little bike shop in order to provide the need for that. And we just asked people to donate their old bikes. We have a place here in town called Kids on Bikes. You may be familiar with that. Sort of similar to what we did at Revolutions back in the day. You can see here, we gave away some bikes, part of our Earn a Bike program. So kids would come in, they would volunteer. So my journey really started in the basement of this church, and our goal was to try to serve the need for affordable bicycles. But what happened over time is people would come in, we would show them how to work on their own bicycles. They basically just had to pay a $40 membership. You could even work that off through sweat equity if you didn't have any money. And so what we did was we allowed people to get bicycles essentially for free at a very, very low rate. But they would come back and they would say, Anthony, I'm really grateful to have a bicycle. It works well. I know how to take care of it to some extent. But the problem is I don't feel safe riding bicycles in the streets. And so that led us to some different places. Obviously, these are very different settings, and I look like a very different person, right, in these pictures. What happened was when we started to ask questions about how can we make our streets safer for people who want to ride bicycles, one of the things that came up consistently was, well, you've got to go talk to the planning department. And the planning department would say, listen, we only draw the plans up. We can put bicycles into the long-term plans, but in terms of actually getting bicycles on the streets, you got to go talk to the city engineer. That's the person who makes decisions about bicycle lanes being implemented. So we went to talk to the city engineer, and the city engineer said, listen, I'm happy to put some bicycle lanes in the streets, but you got to go talk to the mayor. I serve at the pleasure of the mayor. And he's the one who sets policy in this city. So we went to talk to the mayor, and the mayor said, Anthony, I really, really support doing bicycle lanes in the city, but the problem is we don't have any money. So you got to go talk to the city council. And the city council said, listen, we actually support putting bicycle lanes in, but we have too many competing priorities in this city. The mayor wants to have it as a point of policy. We can support it as a council, but we don't have any money. And so they said, you got to go and figure out where the money comes from. And that was federally. That's where the vast majority of money for our roads come from. So this is us here with Steve Cohen, the congressman from Memphis. We're giving him an award because we were able to make some progress doing bike stuff in Memphis. This is former Senator Bob Corker from Tennessee. Some of you may remember him. We went to meet with him and try to get his support. And then we're outside of Senator Lamar Alexander's office here. And so I shared this with you to say, as a primer, if you really want to do engaged work and make a difference in the community, it requires building relationships with a diverse group of people. That is fundamental to being able to do this work. The folks in this previous slide here, these are very different people than the folks in this slide right here. And that is really the foundation for doing effective advocacy work, is to be able to build those relationships across lines of difference and with a diverse group of people. And that's what we really want to start to talk about tonight, right? We want to be able to build on what we heard from our neighbors in the panel last week about the importance of building relationships. Every single one of them emphasized that in their comments. And for you all, you're already busy at work, right? Doing some of this stuff in your neighborhood. But when you start to organize in a more concerted way, right? Partially what you're here to learn about. When you start to build those relationships with your neighbors, you start to have to think about, right, what is the neighborhood plan going to look like, and how are our voices going to be heard in that space? The core question is, how will you bring people together around shared values for a shared purpose? You heard all of our speakers last week talking about that. What are the shared set of values that we can operate from? How do you get your group on the same page? How do you work through conflict? And through it all, how do you keep the main thing, the core thing that you are focused on? You can do that by being a consensus builder. So I want to talk a little bit about what consensus is and what consensus is not. I want to talk about these three different models, right? Just to give you some frameworks for thinking about what this looks like. Unanimous consent will be the first one we'll talk about. Majority rule will be another one that we talk about, and then consensus, right? And we'll talk a little bit about these three different models. And as we go through these next slides, I want to encourage you all, as I break these down, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I want to encourage you to raise your hand. And if you feel comfortable, just weigh in with a couple of comments. Right. So as we move into these next few slides, definitely be prepared to speak up if you feel so moved. Let's start with unanimous consent. This is something, if you've ever been involved in legislative work at the state legislature, the city council, you've gone to any of those meetings, you may have seen this because this is used often in parliamentary processes. Often you'll have at the beginning of a meeting, what are those things that we don't really need to talk about? They're non-controversial. Right? We're just going to go ahead and vote on that full list of things, unanimous consent, right? There's not really any debate, right, that goes along with that because we all pretty much agree, right? Or we think we agree, right, on those kind of things. So when you think about this first sort of process of approaching decision making, what are some of the benefits of going with unanimous consent, and what are some of the drawbacks as you think about being a neighborhood leader and you consider this model of unanimous consent? Anybody want to jump in?
Isn't it kind of rare to have unanimous?
Well, Lisa, yeah, like if you go to a city council meeting, they'll always have a unanimous consent agenda. So there'll always be stuff that's on there. But what would be a drawback of a process like that? And I think your comments are kind of getting towards that, Lisa. What's the drawback of unanimous consent?
Somebody's going to be left out because not every viewpoint or stakeholders' purpose will be incorporated into a unanimous decision.
Exactly, Cimarron. Inevitably, there's going to be viewpoints that don't comport with the unanimous group, right? That aren't actually aligned with what's going through there. And so if you don't incorporate that conversation, right, into the process, then you may actually be marginalizing people, right? So that could be one of the drawbacks, right, for unanimous consent. One of the things that's helpful for it is if you have that process on the front end and you go through the parliamentary process, well, then when you actually go to vote, maybe you've had all those conversations in small committees, right? You can do that in your nonprofits as well. But that's just one thing to be aware of. You don't want to eliminate perspectives, and you do run the risk of that if you're not careful with unanimous consent. Okay, majority rule. Y'all are probably familiar with this one. This is the way our systems of government operate here in the United States. It's a winner takes all model, and minorities are often left out, right, of that process. So when you think about, right, some of the upsides to a majority rule process, and again, you can do this in your neighborhood board, you can do this in your nonprofit, right, in your little neighborhood group, whatever it is. What are some of the upsides to majority rule, and then what would be some downsides to majority rule? And you can speak from your own experience.
Some upsides for majority rule would be, for example, over at the Supreme Court, they have 9 people who are voted, and that's a majority rule. But having an even number would be probably a problem because now you can have 5 and 5 being voted.
Yeah, exactly. And you bring up the Supreme Court, Jose, and a majority rule system, you know, you've got 5 people on the Supreme Court who may make a decision, and then there's 4 justices who don't agree with that decision, right? There's always dissenting opinions. And that means that oftentimes some people are going to be upset. And the winner, again, the winner takes all in that scenario. So, and and we got here, I don't know who Chinook Center is, but majority rule can be more efficient, but can leave a sizable upset minority. Exactly. And in some ways, that's kind of the nature of our politics in the United States right now. It's a majority rule kind of winner takes all scenario. So for you as a neighborhood leader, right, when you're looking at unanimous consent, do we all just agree on this and we're just going to push it through without conversation? That's one model. You look at majority rule and you say, hey, we're going to do straight thumbs up, thumbs down vote. If there's 6 of us who vote for this and 5 who vote against, right, the votes for are going to go for it, right? And so you've got to be conscientious, right, of some of the implications of that model. The last one, oh, hey, John, good to see you. The last one I want to talk about is consensus, right? So the difference between building consensus, right, and this is not unanimous. So this is not everyone agreeing on everything, right? The thing about consensus, right, that's both good and challenging is that you work towards a collective interest, not towards your individual interest. So when you've got 15 people in a group, right, you need to figure out how to get, 13, 14 of them, right, all sort of rowing in the same direction. And maybe you've got one person, right, who is dissenting, maybe not fully there. Ideally, you'd get everybody on the same page, right? But the key idea there is you have a collective interest. It's not about your individual interest. It's about what does the group want. To get to that point, you have to create space for dialogue and space for critique. So that means it can get messy. It can be difficult. You can put a proposition out there and the proposition you start with may not be the proposition that you end with. It may not be where you land, right? And nobody in a consensus building context, if it's done effectively and done well, almost nobody is going to get 100% of what they want. And that's the bottom line for consensus, right? And this is distinct, right, from unanimous consent. Everybody agrees, right? Or at least you've had a process, we're all on the same page. Majority rule, like as was pointed out earlier, you may have a sizable minority who's not happy about it. Consensus is the contrast to that. You're really trying to develop a shared collective self-interest. And that's what you want to move towards as you start to make decisions based on consensus. This slide just gives you a sort of sense of what this would look like, right? If you were to actually begin to undertake a process of building consensus, and then we'll move into some skill building around specific things that you can do. But you sort of introduce, right, and sort of clarify the process and the agenda. So you say, look, this is what we want to move towards. We've got a concern. You can often start with a concern or a problem, right? We got a concern, they're going to build this development. There's going to be a road that's coming through our neighborhood. We want to decide, right, exactly how we feel about this as a group. And you don't want to assume that everybody's going to feel negatively about it, right? So you start with what you want to do. You sort of say, this is the process that we're going to go through. And you can articulate these steps. Discussion, right? Can we agree on a proposal, discuss it, make a decision, implement it, evaluate and reflect? You want to tell everybody the process that you're going to go through. It's really important to lay out a roadmap for people, right? On the front end. You don't want this to be a mystery novel. You don't want folks to not know where you're going, right? Once you engage into your discussion, just throw a bunch of ideas out there. I have some design thinking activities that I use, but you just want to get folks to throw ideas out. I use a lot of sticky notes. Put your ideas on sticky notes. Let's figure these things out, right? See if you can come to a proposal. Can we agree on moving ahead with this specific thing? We think that we can support the road project as a neighborhood, but we want some changes. And what kind of specific changes do you want to see, right? Let's outline the specific components of what that looks like. What are the 5 to 7 amendments that we want to, come up with? Let's discuss those in detail. And then let's make a decision. We're going to agree on this proposal with these changes, right? And then we're going to work together to implement the decision. And as a group, you can decide who's going to do what. And this part, right, sometimes we miss this part, but I want to encourage you all as neighborhood leaders and as folks who are going to be potential on your neighborhood networks. After you've gone through that process, whether you win, meaning you get the recommended changes that you want for the city, the road project, whether you get a portion of it, which is most likely, or whether you lose outright, take some time, reflect and evaluate. And don't just say, hey, we achieved our goal in this process. Aren't we great? But how did we as a group go about doing our work? Are there some things that we could change in terms of building our group dynamics so that when we go through this process the next time, we can be a little bit more effective as a group? The reflection, evaluation, and improvement phase, right, in terms of building consensus is so very important. Okay, y'all. So that is your neighborhood university nutshell version of consensus, what it is, right? Kind of what it looks like. I want to talk for a few minutes about what consensus is not. Consensus is not about being a lone wolf, standing by yourself, and making your point about your house and about your neighborhood. That's not what consensus is. For those of you who've been involved with neighborhood work, you've probably seen those kinds of processes play out. Maybe you even have one or two people, right, within a context who are saying, yeah, this is what it's all about. This is what we really care about. And it may be true for those people, but is it true for the rest of the neighborhood? Being a lone wolf can be very difficult because you're always working in a limited political economy. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you go and you speak in front of city council and you put your foot down, you say, it's my way or the highway, this is how it is by God. The next time something happens in your neighborhood, the next time you have to go in front of city council, they will remember that, and they will remember you, and they will remember that you don't represent your neighborhood. So building consensus is not about being the lone wolf. And you see a lot of folks rolling up in these streets acting like the lone wolf. And I want to encourage and implore you all to be mindful of not doing that, because ultimately, I don't think you'll achieve the goal that you have. Building consensus is also not antagonistic. It's collaborative. It doesn't mean you have to agree on everything. And this is an important distinction. Just because you don't see everything the same way, you don't even agree on the proposal in its totality, right? That doesn't mean that you have to be antagonistic. What do I mean by that? Being rude, demeaning other people, telling other people they're wrong. Just because someone has a different viewpoint, right? And that includes our city council people, and that includes developers, right? Doesn't mean you have to be antagonistic. And I want to encourage you all to really be mindful about that in the way you ask questions, the tone that you use when you speak to your neighbors and to your public officials, because, you know, the old adage, right? Like, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, right? I don't know why you want to catch flies, but the point, right, still stands. It's important to not be antagonistic. And I want to remind you of that limited political economy. It's especially important if you don't agree with other people to be very mindful about not antagonizing those folks. Ask questions. We'll get into some of the skill building here in just a moment, right? But ask questions to make sure you really understand what people are trying to say, and then help them help you understand how they arrived at that understanding. Because a lot of times, if you ask people to show their work, so to speak, tell me about how you came to sort of think about it that way, and you're genuinely interested, that's a way of working through what could be a conflict, a difference of opinion, without being antagonistic, right? And then finally, building consensus is not about you. This is the hardest part about it. If you're going to be a neighborhood leader, if you're going to build consensus around common concerns and common solutions in your neighborhood, it's about your neighbors. It's about other people. And that is going to mean often, if you're really serious about this and building power with other people in your neighborhood, you may end up advocating for things that aren't 100%. And often this will be the case, that aren't 100% of what you want to do. And if you land in that place, you're probably doing it right. And this is going to probably sound a little bit like, what in the world, right? Because we do not really live in that world right now in the United States. We live in a highly individualized society. It's about what I want. It's about when I want it. And it's about getting it my way, just like Burger King. But I'm here to tell you, that is not how you're going to build consensus. And long term, that is not how you build power. So those are some things as you're sort of considering, right, this model that I want to implore you to really think hard about, right? It's important to consider this. And so you're thinking, well, Siracusa, you're telling us all this stuff about consensus, right? Like, it's super hard. Like, why do we need to do this? When you build stronger relationships with your neighbors through a high level of intentionality, listening to their concerns, not leading with your own concerns per se, but listening to their concerns, you will build more collective power. Building those strong relationships, the more you have, the more power you have. Full stop. Again, this is not communist China. This is not communist Russia. There are studies out there that suggest we live in an oligarchy. There are record levels of people doubting the efficacy of democracy in this moment where we are sitting and talking about participating in a participatory democracy. But I still believe, and maybe that makes me old-fashioned, that you can build collective power by linking up with people. And I have seen, particularly in these local contexts at the city and county levels, that you will be more effective in achieving results if you do that through collective power. The other thing, when we're talking about listening, it's not just listening to your neighbors. I hope when we were at the orientation, I'm sure many of you did, you were very engaged in listening to our elected officials, because you can build that deep sense of trust and you can build power by connecting with elected officials in this process as well. What drives them? What do they care about? I hope you came out of that elected officials panel thinking, here's what Stan Vanderwerf is really caring about. Here's what Nancy Hingham really cares about. And we're going to get into some techniques here when we get into the interactive portion of the workshop, where you're going to practice learning to identify that. What is their self-interest? What is the thing that is driving their engagement in the community? Why do they get out of bed every day and do this work? What do they care about? So this isn't just about building power with your neighbors. It's also about doing this with elected officials. And ultimately, if you can do this work of building strong relationships with your neighbors and with your elected officials, because you have a high level of awareness about who they are and what they care about, you can take shared action that flows from a sense of shared values. And that is going to give you stronger persuasive power. If you're speaking in the terms that appeal to your neighbors, if you're speaking from a sense of values that appeal to your elected officials because you have listened to them, because you know them, you are going to be more persuasive when it comes time to make an ask of them. And at the end of the day, when you're working with elected officials and with your neighbors, as a leader, you're going to make an ask. You want them to do some things, right? And so you're going to be more persuasive if you have that understanding of what the shared sense of values are. And by the way, in your neighborhood networks, you will actually develop a shared set of values. That's where you'll start, because everything really flows for you as a group from that shared sense of values. All right. So how do you do it? I think it's probably clear by now, but just to put a fine point on it, building consensus starts before you get the whole group in the room. So you don't wait until you've got your neighborhood network board together or the city council meeting, right, to start figuring out how can we build consensus around an issue. It starts with individual relationships with the people that you are working with, and it requires building those relationships. And I'll give you some skills, and we're going to get into it here in just a minute. All strong relationships depend on trust, and trust flows from a number of factors. People need to believe that you are invested in the success of them and of your neighborhood. That is how you build trust with other people. That often means you have to put your ego in the back seat, your issues, your concerns, right? People want to know that you're invested in their success and in the success of your neighborhood. That is something that is bigger than you, not just yourself. It requires a deep understanding of the people that you're working with. You don't need to know everything about them. That's not what this is about, but you do need to know some things. You absolutely need to know some things. And it is especially important to understand a person's self-interest. And let me explain what I mean by self-interest. A person's self-interest is that thing which most motivates and animates that person to be engaged with whatever you're working on. I'll repeat that. That is the thing that most motivates and animates a person to be engaged with whatever you're working on, or your group or your nonprofit. Why are they doing that? And if you ask them that question directly, you may not get the best answer. So what we're going to go through at the end of this, this little talk I'm going to give are some activities where you're going to practice trying to get to that self-interest. Folks need to know a little something about you as well. And one of the things that I want to strongly recommend that you put into your toolbox, and this is where we're going to start moving into the skill building, are one-to-one relational meetings. Now, when you think about a one-to-one meeting, you might think about the conversation that you have with your boss or a direct report, right? Meetings where you have an agenda, there's things you need to do, right? You got to talk about what's been done, but there's rarely time in those meetings, right? Because you have so many things that you need to do, to talk about other things, in particular, a person's story. This is the core thing that I want you to take away from understanding in a one-to-one relational meeting. I want you to be mindful about trying to understand someone else's story. And I'll go into some components of what I mean by that. And these are the things, when you start to put the pieces together about a person's story, you can start to understand what most deeply motivates and animates that other person. And again, if you just ask that question directly, you might get a very different answer than if you go about it in a more intentional, slower approach. Also, when you get into a one-to-one meeting, you don't want it to feel too transactional. You don't want someone to think that you're using them. You're learning about them for the purpose of using them, right? You want to begin to build a relationship on a ground of genuineness, honesty, and authenticity that comes from a true curiosity on your part about another person. That is the core component. And you want to be able to do that in an intentional space that you create. So when you set these up, you want to tell people on the front end, hey, I want to set up a one-to-one meeting, and this is what this is about. I want to learn more about you. I want to learn more about your story. We don't get a lot of those meeting requests. At least I don't. And when you take that high level of intentionality, right, people are often very flattered because you probably already know this. Most people love to talk about themselves. And very rarely do they really get the chance to do that. And so usually if you tell folks, hey, I'd like to have a meeting, I'd like to learn more about your story, oftentimes they'll say, absolutely, I'd love to do that with you. In a good one-to-one meeting, you as the listener, you will spend 80 to 85% of your time listening to the other person talking. So it is very important to ask questions that allow your dialogue partner to speak and share in a way that makes them feel comfortable, and from a place of honesty. And I'll tell you one good way that I've done this, and the conversation usually flows from one question. Hey, tell me a little bit about the place where you grew up. If you start with that question, then all you have to do is ask follow-up leading questions. And before you know it, an hour will go by, right? So starting with that question, right? You don't need to inquire about a person's family life or things that they might consider part of their private relationships. And that's something that I want to distinguish here, right? The difference between public and private relationships. You just want to be focused on having a relationship that is public with that person, right? So once you start to get them flowing in a comfortable way, right? And you can figure out where there may be some boundaries and barriers, and that's important to understand. Then you ask those follow-up questions, and here's what you want to pay attention to. When you're listening to them talk, and this is why you got to have a high level of intentionality about listening. What is exciting to them? What is frustrating to them? These are often really good areas to follow up with why questions. Right? I noticed when you were talking about that first job that you had, it seemed like that was a frustrating situation. Like, would you mind to explain a little bit about why that was frustrating to you at that time? Asking those why questions, when you can start to ask why questions, you're getting deeper, you're getting closer to really understanding that person's self-interest. So that's the skill and the tool that we're going to work, one of the two that we're really going to work on today. We're actually going to do some one-to-one meetings. Okay. The second component, and this is what we're going to use to warm up and get going into one-to-one meetings, is a public narrative. This was a model developed by Marshall Gans up at the Kennedy School at Harvard. It has three components. The story of self. Who are you and where do you come from? The story of us. What are the communities that you belong to? And then the third leg of this stool is the story of now. Given who you are and the communities that you come from, how are you called to leadership in this moment? Now, for you as a leader, and we're actually going to just develop a short draft of this, I would really encourage you to spend some time like writing this up. Like take some time, 2-3 pages. You don't have to show it to anybody, although I'd be happy to review it and give you feedback if you want to. I would really encourage you to nail this down, because when people can talk about these components in a succinct way, it is incredibly moving. And there's some examples I typically use when I do a class on this. But these are the 3 components. I want to talk just for a minute about each of these. And if you're taking notes, I want to encourage you to take a few notes on this, because we are going to, you're going to develop a little public narrative. So for your story of self, part 1, what were those formative moments in your life? Specifically moments when you made key choices. So I'll just tell you one quickly. We made a choice to move from Memphis, where I was born and raised, to come out to Colorado. That was a key moment in my life, right? So what are those, right? Think about your life as being like a river with bends in it, right? What are those moments where the river bends and you make this key moment, you go in a different direction, right? Those are some of the things you want to think about, because it's often those moments that helped you become you. What values were reflected in those decisions? Maybe you didn't know at the time it was a value that was being reflected. Maybe by making that choice, you codified a value in your life, right? So what were those key moments, those formative moments that made you who you were, that made the values that you're about, right? The values that you stand for. What role did mentors play? This is another component. Who saw something in you that maybe you didn't see in yourself? Who was that person? What was that moment? What are the implications for that? And then, of course, challenges. What were some key moments where you faced challenges? What choice did you make in the face of those challenges? And what was the outcome? What happened, right, when you made that choice in the face of a challenge? These are some good ways to start to nail down the story of self, the story of you. And that's the first component to your public narrative. Secondly, the story of us, the communities that you belong to, family, faith, culture, organizations, nations, movements, constituencies, professions, neighborhoods. What are the communities that you belong to? Do you have a common past with these people? So for example, I grew up in an Italian Catholic family. Being both Italian and Catholic was very central to my identity. It was a core part of how I became who I was, because it was a community that I was a part of. We had a common past, right? When did you become aware of those communities? Was it fate? Was it choice? Was it both? Did you choose in? You born into it, right? And then this is an important one. Why does it matter that you're a part of this community? Do you have a shared set of values, a shared set of stories? What makes you feel like you belong in that community? And then finally, what does it mean for how you think about your future? When you're in your neighborhood, do you envision a future, right? As part of that neighborhood? Do you envision a future, right? Do you think about your future in terms of being part of your family, right? How does the communities that you belong to influence the way you think about the future of your life? Because sometimes we join or are a part of communities, or those communities are meaningful to us because we have shared futures. So that is the story of us. That's the second component of your public narrative. And then finally, the story of now. What in our current moment inspires you to action? Y'all are all here at 6:42 on a Tuesday night. You could be at the bar, you could be hanging out with your family, you could be having some fun, you could be at the bowling alley, you could do a bunch of different things, but you're here. That means that you are in some ways inspired to be a part of making change. You want to learn those skills and tools. What inspires you to be engaged? And specifically, what inspires you to take action now? And this is the secret sauce for a public narrative. How does that story of self, how you became who you were, who you are, the communities that you belong to, that raised you up, that give you that strength now, with whom you see a common future, how do those components link you to this moment right now where you are inspired to take action. If you can explain that, you will have an extraordinarily compelling public narrative. And you can also, of course, look for these components when you're talking to other people, right? So your public narrative, story of self, story of us, story of now. I want to say one last thing here before we get into the activity, and then I'll stop talking. It's going to be interactive the rest of the time. So as you listen to this, you may be wondering, like, what is appropriate to share, right? In a space with other people as they narrate their identities. And I just want to talk a little bit more about public-private relationships. I alluded to that, but I just want to talk about it a little bit more. Public relationships are those relationships we maintain with colleagues, associates, public officials, or those in formal positions of power with whom we are building relationships for the pursuit of shared work. So I don't think using the term transactional is the best way to put that, but the idea is that you have a shared set of work that you want to accomplish with someone who is not a part of your family or your close inner circle, right? And so that's what those relationships are going to be. And in those public relationships, it's critical to have boundaries. That can include protecting your personal life, information about your partner, your family members, your health, other things that you simply don't want to be public. So this is not about me telling you, you got to go tell everybody your business, right? That's not what this is about. Those private relationships, right? Those are the places where you can share those kinds of things. Partners, spouses, friends, family members. Often people we do not have a direct connection to work with, right? So that can usually be a helpful distinction. Maybe you do some work with your family and maybe you do some work with your friends, right? But for the purpose of this exercise, and just really in terms of your own work, right? I think it's helpful to maybe be thinking about those boundaries. You may confide, right, in those people, things about your health and well-being, your finances, other things that may not be appropriate to share with other people. So it's up to you. You have to decide what is your public relationships, what are your private relationships, what goes into your public narrative, underlining that public part, right? In terms of building these relationships with other people so that you can get to building consensus. Okay, we're going to work on public narratives, but I want to stop for a second, just see any questions, thoughts, and comments after listening to me for 40 minutes. Bless your hearts.
I do.
Yeah, Wandalin, go ahead.
Yes. You brought out some very important points that I'm very concerned about. And I was taking notes here. But for instance, like you said, why the consensus and the stronger relationship with my neighbors, establish trust, and with the story of self, you hit on the role of mentors. Well, I've been here at this address for 10 years now, and I just don't like the fact that I still feel like a stranger because I'm from the South, and when we walk down the street, it's always, hey, how you doing? How your mom and them? You know, that's a New Orleans thing. That's all one word. That's all one word. How your mom and them? But anyway, and it's like they're almost afraid of you. People, I mean, immediately back up and they may close their doors. Now I'm on the sidewalk there, you know, standing on their porch, and I always speak to people as I pet. Hello, hello, uh-oh, hello.
We can hear you, Wandalin. Keep going.
We hear ya.
Okay, I always speak as I pass by, but I'm not getting that back. So what should I do? How should I bring me in closer for trust? I don't want to go and sit at their table and have coffee with them yet, but just a hello and maybe a sentence or two.
Absolutely. Well, I am, spoiler alert, going to encourage you to go have coffee with them.
Oh,
That is,
I
that
love,
is in
I
fact,
love my coffee now. I love my coffee.
there you go. That'll help. And that's kind of where we're going to go with this. And we'll do some one-to-one meetings. But I do
Okay.
want to encourage you to do that. It can absolutely start with a kind word, but especially if you're going to
Yes.
start doing work in your neighborhood, like I
Mhm.
said, on a specific project, you're going to be on your neighborhood network board, engaging in those, you can do it over coffee, a one-to-one over coffee or lunch or whatever. That's really the way. There's no shortcut. There really isn't. And so, and we'll get into that just a little bit more here in a minute, Wanda Lynn. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
comments.
Thank you.
And I'm from the South too. I tell people all the time, you go to Walgreens and people just start talking to you.
Thank you. Exactly. And like I said,
That's-
10 years, and people have seen me just picking up trash in front of their house because it's next door. And I'll just, pick up trash and walk down the street and pick up. I've been here, so.
Yeah, I hear you. That was a big culture shift for me coming from the South, and I'm still not used to it. So but we'll
Yeah.
talk a little bit more, Wanda Lynn.
Thank
Y'all
you.
want to
Thank
get
you.
other folks, thank you. Let's get other folks in the conversation. Anybody else with questions, thoughts, or comments when we move to our activity? Yeah, Kelsey, go ahead.
Just to kind of follow up with what Wanda Lynn said, I actually saw an interesting quote earlier today, or like just a statistic, that 40% of most neighbors will actually avoid direct contact with their immediate neighbors because they're nervous about some type of conflict coming up in the future between them. And so they
Mhm.
don't want to develop a very close relationship with them in case a conflict would develop. So I thought that was an interesting statistic that I don't know if it's just Google reading into me being a part of this or whatever. All of a sudden, these little neighborhood statistics have been shooting at me this last week and whatnot. So, but yeah, that was just kind of an interesting thing that I was like, 40%. And I have felt that too. So I've seen that. We just moved into a new neighborhood recently and just trying to, it's easier with kids because kids just kind of introduce themselves and they kind of input themselves into people's lives. So that's been
So
helpful.
very true. That is very true. Yes.
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that too, Kelsey, because the irony of that is it is much easier to work through a conflict if you have a relationship.
Mm.
But
Amen.
so, right, that's the irony, right? And so, but that's what we got to do, y'all. And listen, I've been out knocking doors, as we get closer to election season. And listen, it's good for your soul. I mean, I first got out there, I've knocked doors before, but I was still nervous, but I did 50 doors on Saturday. I'm gonna do 50 more on next Saturday. And
Wow.
this is what we are called to do as neighbors. We've got to start breaking down those barriers. And so Kelsey, thanks for raising that up. That's a really, it's an alarming statistic, but it's also a call to action, right? We got to build those relationships.